Rome, the greatest empire the world had ever seen, on the brink of destruction. Invaders at the gates, their leaders desperate, their enemies relentless. This wasn't just the collapse of a city. This was the end of an era. But how did it come to this? How did unstoppable legions fall to barbarian tribes, Huns, Goths and Vandals, who would tear Rome apart piece by piece? These are the stories that changed Europe forever. The brutal invasions, the betrayal, the power struggles. If you think you know how Rome fell, think again. Stay with me as we uncover the truth behind these barbarian tribes, because this is where the story of medieval Europe truly begins. A story of survival, of war, of the transformation of a continent. But before these tribes became the forces that would bring empires to their knees, they were something else. The Germanic peoples were not conquerors at first. They were survivors. For thousands of years, they lived on the edges of the world, in the shadows of dense forests and windswept shores. Isolated from the great empires to the south, they built their own world, a world of warriors, hunters, and tribal leaders. But the pressure was building. By 1800 BCE, they had started to grow. More people, fewer resources. The forests that had once sheltered them now closed in. These were not the barbarians Rome would later fear. They were families, tribes, desperate for new land and opportunities. The question was no longer whether they would move, it was when. And so they moved, slowly, steadily, southward, from the North Sea coast into the heart of Europe. It wasn't a conquest, it was survival. Harsh winters, changing climates, and overpopulation pushed them further and further, seeking fertile land and better opportunities. This is where the story begins. The Germanic tribes weren't just invaders, they were traders, hunters, and farmers. They built a culture based on strength, but also on trade, exchanging amber from their shores for the riches of the south. These were the seeds of the movement that would one day shake the foundations of the Roman Empire itself. But the journey south wouldn't be easy. As they spread across Central Europe, the Germanic peoples were entering dangerous, contested lands. Every step was a challenge, every day a fight for survival. And soon they would encounter a force far stronger than anything they had ever faced, the Roman Empire. It wasn't long before the Germanic tribes found themselves staring across the mighty Rhine River, face to face with the most powerful force on earth, the Roman legions. The once isolated tribes of the north had now reached the edge of a colossal empire, one that was expanding relentlessly, and Rome was ready to fight. By the 2nd century BCE, the Germanic tribes, Cimbri and Teutoni, had begun their slow, determined march southward. Desperation and survival drove them from the dense forests of the north into the lands held by Celts and Illyrians, eventually reaching the borders of Rome itself. The clash was inevitable. The first encounters between Rome and the Germanic tribes were nothing short of ferocious. General Gaius Marius, 110 BC, 82 BC, one of Rome's greatest military minds, would be the one to face these northern invaders. It was a clash of cultures, a battle for survival on both sides. For the Germanic tribes, it was about finding new lands. For the Romans, it was about defending the empire. These early battles would test the mettle of both sides. The Romans, trained in the art of war, fought with precision and discipline. The Germanic tribes, driven by a relentless hunger for survival, fought with raw, untamed ferocity. The result was bloody and brutal. Marius would eventually defeat the Cimbri in 101 BC at the Battle of Vercelli, but this was just the beginning. A storm was brewing, and it would not be long before it struck at the very heart of Rome. Autumn 9 CE. The Roman legions were on the march, deep in the forests of Germania, but something was wrong. What had begun as a routine mission would soon become one of the darkest days in Roman history. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. The legions, led by Publius Quinctilius Varus, 46 BC, AD 9, had been lured into a deadly trap set by the Germanic chieftain Arminius, 18 or 17 BC, 21 AD. What followed was a massacre. 3 entire Roman legions were wiped out, their soldiers slaughtered in the dense, unforgiving forests of Germania. The shockwaves of the Teutoburg disaster reverberated throughout the empire. Emperor Augustus himself is said to have cried out in despair, "Varus, give me back my legions." The defeat marked a turning point. No longer could Rome simply march into Germania and expect to conquer. The tribes had proven their strength, and from this moment forward, Rome would be on the defensive. The early interactions between Rome and the Germanic tribes were not just battles. They were the opening chapters of a conflict that would shape the destiny of both Rome and the barbarian peoples for centuries to come. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest had taught Rome a harsh lesson. These so-called barbarians were not to be underestimated. This was just the beginning. The fall of the Roman Empire didn't happen overnight. It began with subtle changes. Even before the major invasions, the Roman world was already transforming. Roman populations were declining. Wars, plagues, and economic instability had taken their toll. And into this vacuum stepped the Germanic peoples. These were not conquerors, yet. Many of them were simply looking for land, for opportunities. As Roman cities emptied, Germanic tribes moved in, not as invaders, but as settlers. They took up lands that had been left vacant by the declining Roman population. And with this came a profound shift in the social fabric of the empire. Rome had always relied on its legions to protect its vast borders, but with fewer Romans to fill the ranks, the empire turned to the very people they had once called enemies. Many Germanic warriors were recruited into the Roman army, trained to fight alongside their former adversaries. Germanic leaders too found their place in this new world. Some even rose to high ranks within the Roman military and government. This process, known as barbarization, blurred the lines between Roman and outsider. As they settled within the empire's borders, the Germanic peoples didn't just assimilate, they became vital to Rome's survival. But this dependence was dangerous. The very people Rome relied on to protect its borders were also those who, in time, would challenge its power. And slowly, imperceptibly, the empire that once seemed invincible began to shift, began to fracture. The seeds of change were sown not in great battles, but in the quiet moments when Germanic settlers took Roman lands and Germanic soldiers joined Roman ranks. This was the beginning of a transformation, one that would not end until the Roman Empire itself had fallen. The pressure was building. By the 3rd century CE, the Germanic tribes had reached a turning point. Once content with survival, their ambitions now set on Roman lands. Their leaders, men like Fritigernus of the Goths, knew that the rich cities of Rome were within reach. They were no longer just tribes, they were growing forces driven by necessity and desire. Rome, the beacon of civilization, was becoming a target. Rome wasn't oblivious to this threat. Commanders like Emperor Valens 328 to 378 AD and Theodosius I 379 to 392 AD recognized the growing danger. Valens would face the Germanic tribes at the infamous Battle of Adrianople on the 9th of August 378 AD, a battle that would expose Rome's vulnerability like never before. In that battle, Fritigernus of the Goths would deal Rome a crushing defeat, annihilating 2/3 of their army and killing Emperor Valens himself. This wasn't just a battle, it was the beginning of the end for Rome's dominance over its eastern frontier on the Danube River. But Valens was not alone. Commanders like Flavius Stilicho 359 to 408 would rise in Rome's defense. Stilicho, the Roman general of Vandal descent, would face off against the Goths under Alaric reigned from 394 to 410 at the Battle of Pollentia in 402. Though he managed to hold them off, the tide was turning, and even Stilicho's victories only delayed the inevitable. On the Germanic side, warriors like Alaric of the Visigoths and Chnodomar of the Alemanni would continue to push Rome to its limits. Alaric's relentless campaigns would culminate in the sack of Rome in 410, a devastating blow to the empire that had once ruled the known world. These weren't mere battles, they were symbols of a changing world. Commanders like Theodosius, Stilicho, Alaric, and Fritigernus led armies that would reshape the fate of Europe. The old empire was crumbling under the weight of these relentless invasions, and nothing would ever be the same. The Germanic tribes, once seen as barbaric outsiders, were now part of the story of Rome's fall, and soon they would carve out their own kingdoms on the ashes of the Roman Empire. This wasn't just the fall of an empire, it was the birth of a new world. The rise of the barbarian tribes wasn't merely an end to Rome's dominance, but the dawn of medieval Europe, a new chapter in history that would shape the world as we know it today. Kingdoms would rise from the ashes of the empire, and new powers would carve their names into history. The collapse of Rome was not the end, it was the beginning of something even greater. A transformation that would set the stage for the Middle Ages and beyond. The forces that seemed to tear Europe apart were, in fact, laying the foundation for the continent's rebirth. Subscribe now to follow this epic journey. Like this video and share it to uncover the truths behind the history of Europe's Middle Ages, because the story has only just begun.